We want to go now to the interview that I did with Mark Joseph Stern of Slate.com about the outrageous federal court ban on the abortion pill mifepristone, which came out last Friday night. Now, late last night, after I finished this interview and as our team was putting together the episode, the 5th District Court of Appeals down in Louisiana issued a temporary order in relationship to this ban. So I want to share a couple of updates. Number one, they paused any full implementation of the ban on mifepristone in the short term. But at the same time, they radically reduced the availability of mifepristone in very, very ominous and dangerous ways. Number one, they made it so that it can only be prescribed in a doctor's office by a doctor. No longer through telemed, you have to show up in person, no longer by nurses and other healthcare providers, only by doctors, radically restricting its availability. It can only be prescribed up to 7 weeks into pregnancy, long before most women know they are pregnant, as opposed to up to 10 weeks, which was the regimen up until yesterday. And perhaps most ominously, they made a lot of these restrictions, including a ban on mailing mifepristone, on the basis of the 1873 Comstock Act. This is a really draconian act that you will learn more about in the interview that we're about to play. So again, this ruling is only temporary. It's not a final decision. And so everything you're about to hear in this interview with Mark Joseph Stern remains highly relevant and important to understand. We're going to follow the interview with some footage from the news coverage of the emergency protests that Rise Up for Abortion Rights held last weekend in response to this ban. And there are more protests being called this weekend. Go to the website, riseupfораbortionrights.org, to learn about that. And with that, let's go to my interview with Mark Joseph Stern. Last Friday, April 7th, a Trump-appointed fascist federal judge out of Amarillo, Texas, named Matthew Kacsmaryk, issued a truly shocking and unprecedented ruling. He ordered the Food and Drug Administration to withdraw its approval of mifepristone.
Protests broke out this weekend over the abortion pill ruling that has the potential to affect not just women in Texas, but women across the country. A conservative federal judge in Texas ruled Friday that the FDA improperly approved the abortion pill mifepristone 23 years ago, ignoring legitimate safety concerns about the drug. Mifepristone is one of 2 approved pills that are used together to carry out more than half of legal abortions in this country.
A drug that is safer than Tylenol and used in more than 50% of abortions in this country. This is the most dramatic and sweeping escalation in the war on women's fundamental right to abortion since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade last year. But that's not all. As our next guest has written about, this ruling also lays the basis for even further restrictions on abortion, up to and including a total abortion ban at the federal level. And it does gross violence to basic principles of law and has already sparked the contours of a constitutional crisis. Mark Joseph Stern is a senior writer at Slate.com. He covers the courts and the law. I am so happy to welcome you back to the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show. Mark, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me back. Always a pleasure.
This is a major ruling. I have it in my hands. It is shocking in what it says, in the language of it, anti-scientific, truly misogynist, unprecedented. And I also have your article in my hand, which is filled with shock at the level of anti-science and lawlessness in this. So I thought, let's start with what this means for women's access to abortion in the immediate sense.
Yeah, so in the immediate sense, the big question is whether the higher courts will stay this decision, put it on hold, put it on ice while it is being appealed up to the Fifth Circuit and then the Supreme Court. The clock is ticking. Judge Kacsmaryk put a 7-day hold on his decision. So he issued it Friday and said 1 week from now, this will take effect. If it is allowed to take effect, it will, in theory, block any abortion provider from prescribing mifepristone, the first drug in a medication abortion, even in blue states where it is perfectly legal. However, and we'll get into this, 20 minutes after Judge Kacsmaryk issued his decision, A different judge in Washington state issued a competing and mutually exclusive decision protecting access to mifepristone in most blue states.
Shortly after the Texas ruling, a Washington state judge blocked any changes to mifepristone's availability in 17 states and the District of Columbia.
And so the real answer to your question is, what will this mean for abortion access? We don't know. We don't know which of those competing orders the FDA is going to abide by. We don't know how aggressive the Biden administration is going to be in pushing back against Kaczmarek. So there's a lot of uncertainty here, but the possibility remains that the judge in Texas, Kaczmarek, could try to say the government has to halt mifepristone, all providers have to halt prescribing it, and anyone who violates this court order will be held in contempt and dragged to Amarillo before me.
Can you talk some about what's the language of this ruling and what are the implications of that?
Before we even get there, let's back up and talk about who this guy is. Matthew Kaczmarek is a lifelong anti-abortion activist. He has spent his entire professional career fighting against abortion, trying to outlaw it and criminalize it under all circumstances. One of his children had a shirt that said, "I survived Roe v. Wade." He
toddler,
is
right?
Yes, that's right. A toddler, not the toddler's own choice to wear. He is obsessed with this issue, and he believes and does not hide this belief that abortion is an ongoing genocide. And he feels he has every moral, religious, legal duty to stop it any way he can. And I think that background is the only way you can understand this decision itself, because as you say, it is a totally lawless decision and it is shot through with ridiculous anti-abortion rhetoric. He refuses to say fetus. Instead, he says unborn person. He really misdescribes how mifepristone works and suggests that a fetus is painfully starving to death and denied nutrition in the womb, as though a fetus subjected to mifepristone would even experience anything. It's only prescribed up to 10 weeks. We're talking about a tiny little clump of cells, as they say. And he refers to abortion providers as abortionists, a long-time slur that's used by opponents to make them sound like butchers, which is a term that didn't appear in that decision, but definitely could have and would have fit right in. And so even setting aside the legal analysis, you have all of this very fraught and partisan language about how abortion is essentially murder that leads him to say that abortion does indeed kill a human being, and strongly implies that by doing so, abortion is itself unconstitutional, a violation of fetuses' constitutional rights, and suggests that he may even have the power to issue a nationwide ban on abortion to protect the equal protection rights of fetuses.
Okay, I want to pause on that last point. Can you just explain on what basis this is being smuggled in, how this is happening? Because very few people are calling attention to this. There's actually a lot of minimizing of the implications of this decision going on. So I think it'd be important for you to explain what you're drawing that from.
Yeah, I will say, I think a lot of court reporters are so shocked and stunned by this decision that they're sort of inadvertently minimizing it because they can't accept how lawless it is. And I think that they have a real vested stake in perceiving the judiciary as a legitimate, trustworthy, and independent institution. And they don't want to grapple with what this decision means for the whole judiciary. But here's what I'm talking about. There is a long-time theory that abortion violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution because fetuses are persons under that clause, and abortion allows them to be murdered and thus violates equal protection. This theory has been a real fringe in the legal academy. Justice Scalia mocked it and rejected it outright. But it has been with the anti-abortion movement from the very, very beginning. The end goal of the anti-abortion movement has always been either a constitutional amendment criminalizing abortion under all circumstances, or a Supreme Court decision criminalizing abortion, holding that fetuses have equal protection rights. And this was an idea that a number of fringe scholars put to the Supreme Court in the Dobbs case, asking the court not just to let states ban abortion, but to force states to pass new laws that outlaw abortion to protect fetuses. That brief was totally ignored by the court, or mostly ignored by the court. Most scholars, even anti-abortion scholars, didn't take it seriously. But Judge Kaczmarek, in his decision, favorably cited that brief, that fetuses have constitutional personhood, and in fact leveraged the argument to justify his nationwide stay of mifepristone by saying that he had a duty to protect unborn persons or fetuses from the violence of abortion to safeguard their constitutional rights. That is fetal personhood in a nutshell. And if taken to its extreme, which I think this judge wants to, it leads to a judicially imposed federal ban on abortion.
Okay, I'd like to talk also about the Comstock Act of 1873. Anthony Comstock was a moral crusader, somebody who really has his parallel in the morality police of Iran, who have become notorious around the world recently, crusading against anything that he considered lewd, obscene, and anything that went through the mail. These were laws that were used to go after Margaret Sanger and others who distributed birth control, or even information about birth control. This was used to suppress Walt Whitman's poetry through the mail. This is a really arcane act that gets resurrected in this ruling. And I think it'd be helpful if you talk some about that and the broader implications of that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you really nailed it. Like, this was a Victorian era law in the 19th century that was designed to censor the mail and really primarily to censor the free flow of information through the mail, to censor freedom of speech. Also contraception, which was a rising issue in the 1870s when this law was passed. And because a lot of men who wrote this law viewed abortion and contraception as the same thing, it purports to outlaw abortion as well. It says any abortion-related tool or drug sent through the mail is criminal, just like any contraception-related drug is criminal. This law was so broad that even in the early 1900s, courts did not interpret it to mean that every single thing under the act that's mailed is a federal crime, because that would mean that, like, almost anything that's mailed is a federal crime. I mean, the First Amendment implications, just setting aside abortion, it would mean that, an edition of People magazine that talks about celebrities going out on a date would be obscene, and that mailing it could send you to prison for 5 years. And so for many, many decades, the courts have interpreted this narrowly to only mean that if you have an intent to violate the law, that you want to break the law and you're using the mail as part of your crime, that could be illegal. But that simply, mailing a birth control or mailing mifepristone or mailing an edition of People magazine, that none of that is illegal. Like, that has been the consensus interpretation. Matthew Kacsmaryk comes in and overrules all of that. He overrules all of these decisions throughout the 20th century that severely limit the scope of the Comstock Act, and says, actually, I think that this law means that anyone who mails mifepristone to induce an abortion has committed a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. And so what that does is it doesn't just serve as a justification to ban mifepristone, but it is an effort to really create, I think, a federal ban on all abortions involving drugs, even if his mifepristone decision is overruled, because, he's basically saying any transportation of this drug is illegal. Well, it has to be transported to get to all 50 states and DC. It has to go through some kind of mail or common carrier to reach its destination. And so even if, a higher court says, actually, he can't, suspend mifepristone's approval, it's possible that a court could agree and say, oh, but he's right about the Comstock Act, and it's now illegal for anybody to send mifepristone through the mail or through a common carrier or anywhere else, which would effectively do the same thing in terms of outlawing medication abortion nationwide.
I want to move to the lawlessness of this, and I want to quote something that you say in your article, which is, you have a lot in this piece that I really appreciated. You say Kacsmaryk's ruling is indefensible from top to bottom and will go down in history as one of the judiciary's most shocking and lawless moments. And then you have a riff in the middle where you kind of detail one element after the other of what this ruling does, and each paragraph is punctuated with, that is not the law. That is not the law. That is not the law, again and again and again. And just talk about some of the dimensions of this.
Well, I mean, let's just zero in on this fundamental premise that he even has the power to overrule the FDA's approval of a drug. Never before in history has a court claimed the power to revoke the FDA's approval of a drug. The FDA is an expert agency made up of doctors and scientists who spend years studying each drug. FDA approval is the global gold standard of a drug's safety and efficacy. And Kaczmarek comes in and says that he can just overrule the FDA. It's not clear that that's even possible through federal law, which has a very detailed and complicated process for withdrawing approval of a drug. The FDA would, in theory, have to follow that process that's laid out by Congress. And Kaczmarek just said, oh, I don't care about any of that. Set it all aside. I think this drug is dangerous, so I'm going to pull it off the market myself. Why did he think it's dangerous? Well, look, there are 150 studies that show that mifepristone is extremely safe and effective, and in fact, safer than Tylenol, Viagra, antibiotics, and insulin. So why does Kaczmarek say it's dangerous? He cites a smattering of anonymous blog posts on an anti-abortion website where the posters claim that mifepristone gave them negative side effects or had negative consequences for them, and uses those blog posts. There are about 50 of them, some of them just a few sentences. He used those to overrule the 150 scientific studies of mifepristone that in fact did show that the drug is safe. Stepping back before that, at each point, you can just find something that's egregiously wrong. Before he even gets there, he has to explain why this case can be brought before him when there is a 6-year statute of limitations on a challenge to an agency action like this. This drug, mifepristone, was approved in the year 2000. Everybody remembers 2000 after Y2K. Bill Clinton was still the president. People still had Furbies, right? That is when this drug was approved. And Matthew Kaczmarek decides that he is going to blow up the 6-year statute of limitations. Why? He doesn't really explain. He just says, well, they deserve it. They deserve to challenge this because they've worked really hard in the last few months to make this court case work. And I'm just going to give this one to them. Again, that is not the law. This is the most lawless decision I think I have ever read. And frankly, I have read a lot of them over the last few years.
Mark, I want to thank you so much for making the time to talk with us here today at the Revolution Nothing Less show.
Thank you so much for having me on. Always a pleasure.
A new front has opened in the nation's ongoing battle over abortion rights. A federal judge issued a ruling that would halt the use of the commonly used abortion pill nationwide. The decision came down late on a Friday of a holiday weekend, but the reaction today was swift, with protests across the country.
Live in Washington Square Park with the very latest on this battle playing out in the courts. Melissa? That rally is underway.
They are with Rise Up for Abortion Rights that stood on the corner of Montrose and Lovett with signs, we know, to oppose the ruling of a federal judge in Texas.
We're here today to make sure that women still have the right to choose to govern their bodies the way that they see fit.
Some in Boston are rallying for women's access to the pill.
Hoy decenas de personas llegaron a la Plaza Federal para mostrar su descontento contra el fallo judicial para una pastilla anticonceptiva que lleva en el mercado. Escuchen esto.
The war on abortion is nationwide.
Protesters hit the streets in downtown Chicago to voice their concerns over this new ruling.
In downtown LA, a small group showed up to voice their disapproval. In 2020, more than half of abortions in the U.S. were done by medication.
Abortion on demand without apology! Without apology!
They chanted their message.
This is going to affect all women in this country.
The group Rise Up for Abortion Rights rallied outside of the federal courthouse in downtown LA.
For anyone who has a heart and who has any inkling of humanity, this should not be normalized. This should outrage you.
The group was part of a nationwide protest Saturday, wanting to fight the recent ruling.
Hands off the abortion pill!
Protesters said it was vital they took to the streets immediately to share how the ruling could impact women's reproductive rights in every state.
And so this is going to impact already flooded Los Angeles, California clinics, because there's all these women from all over the country who have to travel because their state abortion is banned.
We can't
Our outrage needs to be unleashed in the streets. When women are enslaved and don't have control over their lives and their futures, no one is free. Overturning of Roe versus Wade was only the beginning, and we're seeing that happen right before our eyes. They're going for abortion pills. They're going for birth control. They're going after LGBTQ people.
This is an assault on the humanity of women. This is an assault on basic reproductive rights. It's also an assault on democracy.
Now, abortion rights advocates tell me that even with a competing ruling by a federal judge here in Washington state, they're not sure what will happen next.
We need to rise up for abortion rights now.